Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to be talking about my Week 2 waiver wire targets for the 2025 fantasy football season. Talking about players at a variety of different positions, the best available quarterbacks, running backs, wide receivers, tight ends, kickers, and defenses on our waiver wires going into Week 2. Players who are not only going to help for our Week 2 matchups, but hopefully for the remainder of the season, as week over week, we're always trying to improve our rosters, whether that is the starting lineup with some streaming options or players who are going to continue to build depth for our bench. Now, a lot of the players that we may mention over the course of today's episode are benefiting from the injuries that took place in Week 1, and this is going to happen for the remainder of the season. Guys like Xavier Worthy going down absolutely propel the value of someone like Marquise Brown that you can see as my #1 wide receiver option when we go into the waiver wire conversation. Additionally, injuries that took place to guys like Brock Bowers, George Kittle, Juwan Jennings, Drake London, both those wide receivers dealing with shoulder injuries. When injuries occur, of course, it's going to propel the value of other players. So before we get into talking about all these waiver wire options, if you guys are looking for my thoughts on a specific player, you could travel down to the description of the video. There are timestamps available there. While you're down there, if you haven't yet already, of course, subscribe to the channel as I'm making daily fantasy football content for the entirety of the season. Of course, live streaming daily later tonight after the Monday Night Football game. Be sure to swing on by, as of course, I'll be going ahead and answering your guys' questions in regards to Week 2 waiver wires and all that kind of jazz, potential trade questions. Anything that you have in mind, be sure to swing on by. I'm more than happy to help. Now, speaking of the Monday night game, the Bears take on the Minnesota Vikings tonight. At the end of today's episode, I will be putting together a couple plays via Betr. So for those of you who are trying to get my upcoming Sunday morning rankings for the remainder of the season, and of course, put together some plays, be sure to go ahead, travel down to the description of the video and check out Betr. When you sign up using code Andrew today, make that first time deposit minimum of $10 and make a first time real cash play minimum of $1, picking more or less on 2 player statistics. You'll be eligible to get my Sunday morning rankings every single week for the remainder of the season. These are by position, by tier, half PPR, full PPR, and includes flex rankings to help you set your lineups every single week. And of course, new users who sign up today get a free $10. So for those of you interested, of course, check out the map to the right side of the screen to determine your eligibility. And if you sign up today, you could also take advantage of the free play of the one and only JJ McCarthy at 0.5 total passing yards. Again, take advantage of that. Thank you very much. All that information down below. All right, let's get into the conversation of our Week 2 waiver wires at the wide receiver position, beginning with Marquise Brown. Of course, there have been a lot of injuries that took place to the wide receiver position. Like I mentioned, Xavier Worthy, Drake London, Juwan Jennings, Jalen Waddle, and Chris Olave also dealing with injuries. They did return to the contest, but we're going to keep those monitored. But in the case of Xavier Worthy, we know that he dislocated his shoulder. Earlier this morning, it was confirmed by Andy Reid, the head coach of the Kansas City Chiefs, that he's quote-unquote day-to-day. Now, as it stands, Worthy is trying to rehab the injury and, of course, wear a brace for the upcoming games. But the expectation is that he probably won't be prepared to play until probably either Week 3 or 4. And in his absence, along with the suspension of Rashee Rice that is going to take the first 6 weeks of the season, and in their absence, there is an incredible vacancy of targets within this Kansas City Chiefs offense that we saw, of course, Marquise Brown take advantage of on Friday night against the Los Angeles Chargers. Now, in his efforts, 16 targets, 10 receptions, 99 receiving yards, and 14.9 fantasy points and a half PPR scoring format. Having played 57 of the 61 snaps, that's 93% snap share. Additionally, with the 16 targets on 46 routes, he had a 35% target rate, which is an incredibly high number. Now, majority of the success and statistics that Marquise Brown gathered in Week 1 were from the slot position, even though he only played 52% of his snaps from the slot. Had 7 targets, 7 catches, and 86 receiving yards from the slot. Of his total, 10 catches and 99 yards. So 70% of his receptions and 87% of his receiving yards from the slot position, which in the absence of Rashee Rice and Xavier Worthy is only going to expand his contributions for fantasy purposes. As of right now, as a reinforcement for the absence of 2 stud receivers, this automatically makes Marquise Brown a weekly start in their absence. If we go back to 2021 to 2023, when Marquise Brown was the #1 receiving option for the Arizona Cardinals offense throughout that span of time, in games in which he was given 10 or more targets, was averaging 14.5 fantasy points per game and a half PPR. When you get elite level of opportunity, it's going to lead to elite levels of fantasy success. And within a Kansas City Chiefs offense that loves to target the slot position as much as Patrick Mahomes does, of course, Marquise Brown, an automatic pickup as the #1 wide receiver this week. Number 2 is Quentin Johnston. As of right now, via Sleeper, he's only rostered in 9% of leagues, and that number has actually even gone up since his performance on Friday night, as there's a couple leagues in which they allow players to be picked up even after they have played prior to the Tuesday waiver period. But he's coming off a great performance. 7 targets, 5 catches, 79 yards, and 2 receiving touchdowns for 22.4 fantasy points, having played 53 of the 65 total offensive snaps. That's 81.5% of the snap share. While Trey Harris only played 5 total snaps, the rookie second-round pick for the Los Angeles Chargers, and Lambert Smith only played 14 of the offensive snaps. As of the entirety of this game, we saw Quentin Johnston exclusively functioning out of the X receiver role in 2 wide receiver sets and still staying in that overall conversation when they got into 11 personnel 3 wide receiver sets, and of course Keenan Allen got onto the field. But being targeted 7 times on his 36 total routes only has him at a 19.4% target rate, primarily because again Ladd McConkey and Keenan Allen are the number 1 and number 2 functioning options. And if, somehow, some way Keenan Allen is available in your league, let this be a PSA. Please pick up Keenan Allen, as he is probably the more valuable of these two between him and Quentin Johnston. Nonetheless, Quentin Johnston's performance here in week 1 wasn't out of nowhere, as when we travel back to 2024, he led the Los Angeles Chargers in terms of receiving touchdowns with 8 total. In 2024, 32.1% of the total targets he had were in the end zone. And last season, in week 18, when he took on the Las Vegas Raiders, specifically, I only mention that because this week they take on the Raiders, so you could pick up Quentin Johnston and play him. When he took on the Raiders week 18 of last year, 14 targets, 13 receptions, 186 receiving yards, 25 plus fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format. And the question is, can Justin Herbert maintain this level of success? Are they going to throw the ball as much as they did on Friday and continue that for the remainder of the season? Well, when we talk about the offensive coordinator, Greg Roman, again, this is his second season with Justin Herbert. Justin Herbert's now fully comfortable within this entire offensive approach. We got to remember that Greg Roman was the OC for the Ravens in 2019 when he led Lamar Jackson to throwing for 36 passing touchdowns on only 401 passing attempts in that year. Justin Herbert had a great end of the 2024 season, in which in the last 11 games that he played, 8 of those games consisted of 2 or more total touchdowns scored. I truly do believe there's a lot of value to be had with Quentin Johnston, but you've got to be able to guess correctly in regards to the games in which he is finding the end zone, because once in fact he does not, it's going to be of a lesser performance. But again, we'll take these kind of players in a deeper league. The next player I wanted to mention is Cedric Tillman. Now, I've said this all weekend long, and for those of you who tuned into the live streams that I conducted on the channel, of course, Sunday morning, 7 a.m. to 10 a.m., and of course, every Saturday afternoon, 1 to 3 p.m. For those of you who are interested, of course, you listened and you heard me say Cedric Tillman is probably a wide receiver that I'm going to mention come Monday because of the efforts of Joe Flacco. And in fact, we are here with Cedric Tillman coming off a performance of 5 catches, 52 and a touchdown for 13.7 fantasy points in a half PPR. And very similar to Quentin Johnston, this is not out of nowhere. We travel back to 2024, weeks 7 through 11, when Tillman was made a functioning wide receiver within this offense and given ample opportunity. With Jameis Winston from week 7 through 11, he was averaging 10 targets per game, 6 receptions per game, 75 receiving yards per game, and 0.75 receiving touchdowns per game. So in 3 of the 4 games, he scored a touchdown, averaging 15.55 fantasy points per game throughout that span of time. Now, in week 1 with Joe Flacco and this Cleveland Browns team that almost pulled out a victory if it wasn't for their kicker, played 67 of the 76 offensive snaps, that's an 88% snap share, was targeted 8 times out of 46 routes, which is a 17% target rate. Again, not the greatest number, but of course we know that Joe Flacco loves to dump it off to his tight ends and running backs, which we saw and will mention with Dylan Sampson and Harold Fannin in just a moment. But when we look at the upcoming schedule for the Browns, they take on Baltimore, Green Bay, Detroit, Minnesota, Pittsburgh, Miami, New England, and have a bye week. For the remainder of that span of time, I expect Joe Flacco to be the starting quarterback. That means there should be a lot of implications for passing the ball. Therefore, Cedric Tillman will be relevant throughout that span of time. This week, they take on Baltimore. Back in week 8 of 2024, he went for 7 catches, 99 and 2 touchdowns against Baltimore. Why not once again, where we just had, of course, Keon Coleman and, of course, Josh Palmer put up some pretty nice numbers against that Baltimore secondary just last night. The next player I wanted to mention is KAYSHON BOUTEE. As it currently stands, only rostered in 4% of sleeper leagues, coming off of a week in which he had 6 receptions on 8 targets for 103 yards and really served as the #1 receiving option of this offense. When we talk about targets as a whole, tied Hunter Henry for the most targets amongst all New England Patriots receiving options in week 1. Having played 58 of the 71 snaps, that's an 82% snap share, 8 targets on 44 routes, and 18.2% target rate. Now, very similar to Quentin Johnston, Cedric Tillman, this is another performance that's not out of nowhere. Late last season, KAYSHON BOUTEE put together incredible performances. So if we include the week 1 performance of 2025 in the final 3 games of last year, in 3 of the last 4 games, BOUTEE has surpassed 95 or more receiving yards with Drake May at quarterback. When we look at week 16 through 18 of 2024, he was averaging just 6.3 targets, 5.3 receptions, but 80 receiving yards per game, and scored a receiving touchdown in 2 of those 3 games to end off the 2024 season, which led to a 14.67 fantasy point per game average in those final 3 games. As it currently stands, with, of course, Stefon Diggs still trying to get himself to 100% rate, KAYSHON BOUTEE and his familiarity with Drake May continues to allow him to be the priority option within this passing attack. Number 5, we have WAN'DALE Robinson. Listen, I've mentioned this offseason, but I'll once again reiterate. Amongst wide receivers from 2019 to 2024 that got 140 targets within a single season, the following year, unless they missed 4 games due to an injury or were suspended for any semblance of time, wide receivers that had 140 targets in 1 year at a base minimum the following year from 2019 to 2024 had 110 targets. WAN'DALE Robinson in 2024 had 140 targets. Going into this upcoming season, he is expected to get over 100, if not 110 targets, regardless of who's playing quarterback. And in week 1 with Russell Wilson, 8 targets, 6 grabs, 55 yards. And in a full PPR is a significantly more valuable prospect, having played 52 of his 68 snaps, a 77% snap share, and had a 22% target rate, 8 targets on 37 routes ran. Again, a lot of value to be had here with a player that is currently only rostered in 23% of sleeper leagues. Again, depending on if you're playing in a full PPR, half PPR, really will determine whether or not you are going ahead and picking up WAN'DALE Robinson this week. The final player I wanted to mention this week is Calvin Austin, currently rostered in 7% of sleeper leagues, coming off of a week in which he had 15 fantasy points because of the receiving touchdown he was able to score. But otherwise, 4 catches, 70 yards, and a touchdown, we'll take it. Having played 80% of the offensive snaps for the Pittsburgh Steelers with a 21% target rate, these are strong numbers that can be built upon as we continue. Now, even though we had guys like Jonnu Smith, Ben Skoranek, Jalen Warren scoring touchdowns within this offense, Calvin Austin, of course, is going to be a continuous contributing factor because of what we saw last season within this Arthur Smith offense. In games in which Calvin Austin had 3 or more receptions last year, was averaging 11.38 fantasy points per game and a half PPR. Opportunity leads to success, and from what we saw yesterday with Aaron Rodgers, he targeted his slot receiving options 13 times yesterday, which led to 11 receptions, 131 yards, and 2 receiving touchdowns. Expect for the primary slot receiver, Calvin Austin, to be very much so relevant for fantasy purposes as we continue on for the remainder of the season. All right, let's continue on by talking about some other receiving options, but some bigger body guys, specifically the tight end position. Like I mentioned earlier, Brock Bowers, George Kittle, Evan Ingram have sustained injuries. And for those of you who are in a league that has Zach Ertz and or Hunter Henry potentially available, as to the leagues in which I saw, they were already rostered in about 50% of leagues. So if they are available in your league, probably lean in their direction, as those are potentially the more veteran options in comparison to the following names. But we begin with Juwan Johnson, currently rostered in 5% of sleeper leagues, taking on San Francisco in week 2, but coming off of an incredible week 1 performance, primarily because the opportunities were there. 11 targets, 8 catches, 76 yards, 11.6 fantasy points in a half PPR. Was the most targeted tight end in week 1 amongst all. Had the 7th most targets amongst all players in week 1, including wide receivers and running backs. Played 74 of the 75 offensive snaps, 99%. And when you're targeted 11 times on 47 routes, that's a 23% target rate, an incredible number. But this performance wasn't out of nowhere. We should have seen this coming when Foster Moreau and of course Taysom Hill were both on the PUP. When they're both placed on the PUP, and he is quite frankly the only functioning tight end within this offense, we should have known that, of course, throughout all personnel, whether it's 11, 12, 13, he's going to be on the field and he's going to be relevant. Even when we look back to last season, in week 17 and 18 with Spencer Rattler as the starting quarterback, we saw Juwan Jennings, 10 targets, 6 catches, 66, 9.6 fantasy points. The next week, 7 targets, 6 catches, 80 yards, 11.0 fantasy points. Even when we look at the last 3 seasons as a member of the Saints, 2022 to 2024, in games in which Juwan Johnson has been given 5 to 7 targets, averaging 9.51 fantasy points per game and a half PPR. Again, the number 1 tight end option going into this week in my mind in terms of available prospects that, again, have a very low rostership percentage. Number 2, Harold Fannin Jr. Having rewatched every single game, I had a lot of fun watching Harold Fannin, primarily because I was incredibly high on David Njoku this offseason. And I'll be the first one to admit it, Fannin is legit, and he's not going anywhere. What he was able to accomplish on 9 targets, 7 catches, 63 yards, over 10 fantasy points, he had just as many targets as Trey McBride and Sam Laporta in week 1, having played 55 of the 76 snaps, having been targeted 9 times on 32 routes, a 28% target rate on 1 tight end sets. On first and second downs, unfortunately only played 30% of the snaps, while David Njoku played 70% of the snaps. But again, He's a rookie. He's going to grow into a greater role. But when we talk about one tight end sets on 3rd and 4th down, played about 46% of the snaps in comparison to David Njoku's 54%. So of course, growing in that overall 3rd and 4th down passing desperate scenarios, as he looks like he is the better of the two within the receiving category. In regards to 2 and 3 tight end sets, of course, was playing 100% of the snaps. Now, if you're wondering, can the Cleveland Browns actually function with 2 tight ends on a consistent basis? Well, I've mentioned it this offseason and I'll continue to reiterate it. Kevin Stefanski, the offensive play caller and of course head coach of this team, has targeted his tight ends at a top 6 rate over the course of the last 5 consecutive seasons. Therefore, we are anticipating that of course Harold Fannin can very easily be relevant this season for the remainder of the year. And from what his contributions looked like yesterday, I truly do believe he is not going anywhere within this offense. Now, for those of you who didn't watch the game, I would compare him very much so to an Isaiah Likely in the way that he functioned within the offense. First and foremost, as a blocker, whether it's just regular run blocking, chip blocking, leading as a fullback, wide receiver, or tight end, it didn't matter. He was an impactful player on the field at all times. Additionally, had himself opportunities out wide, in the slot, in the inline, running slants, running outs. It doesn't matter. They allowed him to just be open on majority of the opportunities. And of course, we know that Joe Flacco is a check down king, but on top of it, they're beginning to utilize him in very intriguing ways. He had himself a rushing attempt as the Wildcat quarterback of this offense on one singular attempt. So again, there's a lot of opportunities. In the way that I see it, he's not going away anytime soon. Yes, he's going to dig into the workload of David Njoku. I'm not overreacting and immediately starting him going into week 2. I don't want to pull an Isaiah Likely from last season based on the week 1 performance he put together. But as we continue on, very much so going to be involved within this Cleveland Browns offense for the remainder of the season and for years to come. The next player I wanted to mention is Brenton Strange. Now, he has the privilege of taking on the Cincinnati Bengals, and we just mentioned moments ago just how much success Harold Fannin had. But if we talk about the entire Cleveland Browns offense, how much opportunity and success the tight end position had against Cincinnati in week 1, of course, that led to 15 targets, 10 receptions, 100 receiving yards. So I'm thinking that Brenton Strange, who's currently rostered in about 25% of leagues, has an opportunity to be a potential starting streaming option for those of you who are dealing with inconsistent play at tight end already in week 1 and or an injury to one of the primary guys like a George Kittle, Brock Bowers, who of course we utilize high draft capital on. Like I mentioned earlier last week, of course the Cincinnati Bengals had given up the most receptions to opposing tight ends in 2024, and that is going to continue this upcoming season. So when we talk about Brenton Strange, who is going to be on the field for majority of snaps, played 80% of the snaps yesterday, was targeted only 4 times, 3 of which those targets occurred on the first drive of the game. I mean, on the first drive of the game, had 3 receptions for 49 and then pretty much disappeared. Outside of Travis Kelce decleating Xavier Worthy, the second best decleater in week 1 was Brenton Strange on a defender of the Carolina Panthers. You guys should check that out if you haven't seen it already. It's one of the most ridiculous blocking efforts I have seen. Absolutely laid him flat. Either way, the other tight end in this offense, Hunter Long, did score a receiving touchdown in the red zone. Hopefully in the future that goes in the direction of Brenton Strange, but we would anticipate a lot of opportunity in his direction considering the matchup on hand and considering, of course, he's continuing to grow within this offense as a primary receiving option behind Brian Thomas Jr. if they, of course, want to target him this week, and, of course, Travis Hunter. The next player I wanted to mention as a final honorable mention is Michael Mayer. In the event in which Brock Bowers is going to miss any sort of significant time, Michael Mayer, of course, will be filling in for him. Of course, Brock Bowers in 3 quarters of play had 5 catches for 103. In his absence, of course, Michael Mayer was still able to get himself fantasy relevant over the course of that game, 4 receptions for 38. So going into this week, if Brock Bowers is to miss, Michael Mayer is a fantastic pickup and play for those of you who are in need of a streaming option in the replacement of your stud number 1 tight end. Okay, continuing on to the quarterback conversation, I really quickly wanted to mention and have a quick reminder that Justin Fields, prior to this season starting, should have been drafted as a top 12 quarterback for fantasy purposes. And even though we weren't excited about the idea of playing him against that Pittsburgh Steelers defense, I'm excited about playing him every single week for the remainder of the season based on what I just witnessed against that Pittsburgh Steelers defense and the amount of success he found not only through the air but on the ground. 16 of 22 passing, a 73% passing completion percentage, 218 passing yards, 1 passing touchdown, 12 attempts for 48 yards, 2 rushing touchdowns, and nearly 30 fantasy points in a 4-point per passing touchdown league. Of his 48 rushing yards, 37 of those on designed runs in comparison to the 11 yards on scrambles. When you're allowing him to be such a relevant option, not only in the QB sneak game, but the boot action in the red zone, it's going to continue to present even more value. And if in fact they're going to see a negative game script taking on the Buffalo Bills, I mean, that Bills defense couldn't stop us anyway. So if they couldn't stop Lamar, maybe Justin Fields can have himself an incredible game. But as of right now, should already be rostered in your league. Currently has a very high rostership percentage across a lot of the platforms, but just wanted to go ahead and once again reiterate, please make sure he's rostered. Now we'll continue on to our actual number one. Yes, it is Daniel Jones. I want to remind you guys really quickly that week 1 of last year, technically Anthony Richardson and Derek Carr were both top 6 at the quarterback position. So the following names I may mention may not actually be relevant for weeks to come, but hey, maybe. Daniel Jones, who has himself rushing upside, scored nearly 30 fantasy points as well. He was in the top 3 conversation next to Josh Allen and Justin Fields this week, having 2 rushing touchdowns from the QB sneak, a 76% passing completion percentage, but now this week has to take on Denver. That didn't look too hot. I mean, yes, their defense looked great, but that was against an inexperienced offense that didn't have very many weapons with Cam Ward. And considering the rushing threat that the, of course, Indianapolis Colts are going to be bringing into this contest, perhaps Daniel Jones could be a player that we pick up, hold, see what he looks like, and potentially even play in future matchups that are advantageous to him within the AFC South division. We continue with Aaron Rodgers, who is currently rostered in 19% of leagues, in comparison to Daniel Jones, who's currently rostered in 10% of sleeper leagues. Aaron Rodgers coming off of an incredible game of a 73% passing completion percentage, 244 yards, 4 passing touchdowns, 25 plus fantasy points, looked incredibly comfortable within this offense, abused that Jets defense with the play action game on multiple occasions. But going into this week's matchup against Seattle, again, if Aaron Rodgers is going to be as good as he was on Sunday, taking on a Jets defense, of course, I think the Seattle defense is a little bit better as it currently stands, but it will, of course, put him to the test. And for those of you who are playing in a potential 2-quarterback league, maybe an 8-team 2-quarterback league, you might want to look in the direction of picking up your 3rd quarterback in the case of Aaron Rodgers as we proceed forward. The final player I wanted to mention is Michael Penix, currently rostered in 35% of leagues, currently dealing with the fact that Drake London went down with a shoulder injury, and Darnell Mooney didn't even play in week 1. If both of those players are not active this week, then Michael Penix against Minnesota is not as enticing of a play. Even though the Atlanta Falcons threw the ball 42 times, and that's an incredibly exciting number to look forward to for the remainder of the season, and even though Michael Penix has red zone rushing upside near the goal line like he demonstrated late last season in the final 3 games of the 2024 year, and once again showed that off with 6 rushing attempts for 21 yards and a touchdown, and nearly 300 passing yards, Michael Penix, potential option if we can get a healthy Drake London and Darnell Mooney going forward as we proceed. All right, let's continue on with the running back conversation with Dylan Sampson. Look, the running back position this week is relatively thin. That is why we're talking about it this late into the video. Usually it's the topic of conversation at the top. But going into this week, again, we have Dylan Sampson as our number 1, coming off of 12 carries for 29 yards, a 2.42 yard per carry average. Not the greatest numbers, but where Dylan Sampson is going to find value not only this week, but for hopefully the remainder of the season, is within the receiving category with 8 targets, 8 catches, 64, and 13.3 fantasy points. Having played 33 of the 76 offensive snaps for the Cleveland Browns, that's 43% of the snap share, 8 targets on 16 routes ran, a 50% target rate, incredibly high and probably unsustainable. With Jerome Ford obviously becoming an afterthought and Quinshon Judkins most likely returning either this week or next, Dylan Sampson is going to be a guy that hopefully is still going to be in the mix at a 50-50 rate with Quinshon Judkins. But I'd also like to hope that Sampson, having showed off his receiving prowess, is going to be able to continue that success. As this most recent week, he played 28 of the 47 early down snaps. So if he's going to be implicated for some rushing opportunity as well, while also being a very much so relied upon receiving option out of the backfield, we know that Joe Flacco wants to get the ball out of his hands quickly as the pass rush gets after him. And when he's able to dump it off in the direction of Sampson, he's able to make as many plays as he does after the catch. Of course, that makes him incredibly relevant in a half or full PPR scoring format as we proceed. The next running back is BRAELON Allen. I think this is more of a PSA. If he isn't already rostered, which he should be, on many of different platforms, I saw him at about 50%. This should already be picked up. Now, again, Breece Hall looked unstoppable. Justin Fields looked like he was an absolute vulture near the red zone. And even with that being the case, technically BRAELON Allen did score a touchdown. Now, even though he wasn't the most efficient runner with 6 carries for 9 yards, not the greatest week as a whole, but he still played 20 of the 64 total snaps, a 31% snap share. He was able to take 2 of the 4 goal line rushing attempts, of course, vultured a touchdown, and then of course was able to play 3 of the 6 short yardage snaps. Primarily, BRAELON Allen is a handcuff until further notice, considering how much rushing we saw out of Justin Fields. So really, he's just a handcuff that has the ability to vulture a touchdown and technically be relevant for fantasy purposes because of that fact. All right, the next player I wanted to mention was within the same matchup as the Jets took on the Pittsburgh Steelers. We saw KENNETH Gainwell come out and be the primary kind of starter of this offense. And even though in due time we did see Jaylen Warren get some looks, KENNETH Gainwell still played 29 of the 56 snaps, a 52% snap share. And even though, again, he did get himself some rushing attempts, wasn't the most efficient back. The way that I see it going forward, Jaylen Warren is still the running back that I want to start. KENNETH Gainwell, of course, is going to get himself looks here and there. I am not dropping Caleb Johnson as of yet. I know that Caleb Johnson did return some kicks this most recent week, and he is currently technically functioning as like the Cordero Patterson of this offense, like the third string special teams player. I think going forward, Caleb Johnson will be able to take over in due time. But until then, if Kenneth Gainwell is going to continue to maintain opportunity within this backfield, certainly could be of value for fantasy purposes. Then we move on to the final player I wanted to mention at the running back position. It is Kyle MONANGAI of the Chicago Bears. Prior to tonight's game, if you already know that you're dropping somebody off of your bench, for example, if you're like, listen, Andrew, Ollie Gordon didn't pan out, Thornton didn't pan out, I'm going to drop them. Okay, great. But if you're going to drop them anyway tomorrow, you might as well drop them tonight in the event in which you're picking up MONANGAI. If he goes off, fantastic. If the Ben Johnson offense wants to support 2 running backs, that is going to help. And for the remainder of the season, of course, you'll benefit from that. But if in fact you drop someone like Ollie Gordon, MONANGAI does nothing anyway, no harm, no foul. I think this is something of an insurance in which you are trying to just probably get ahead of the upcoming waiver run by picking up this player that is currently only rostered in about 15% of sleeper leagues. All right, let's close out today's video by talking about kickers and, of course, team defenses. We begin with Cam Little, who, again, should already be rostered. I saw that he was rostered in 50% of ESPN leagues. That is far too low. This is a kicker that not only scored 15 points in week 1, but to close out the 2024 season in 3 of the last 4 games had 10 or more fantasy points and scored a 70-yard field goal in the preseason. Please roster Cam Little. This offense has improved. They're going to put themselves into positions in which field goals are going to be a relevant part of their attack. Now, if we're talking about other kickers that also should be obviously rostered, but are still at a lower number, Tyler Loop. Please, any kicker that is associated with the Baltimore Ravens is of value. Justin Tucker, yes, was a great kicker on his own in terms of accuracy, but when we're given the volume of kicking opportunities, considering how often the Baltimore Ravens offense scores, Tyler Loop is going to be relevant all season long. If he is somehow, some way still available in your league, do yourself the favor and pick him up. We move on to Chad Ryland, who is another one of these kickers, but one that truly is incredibly low roster rate in terms of a 2% rate. In week 1, had 10 fantasy points. Yes, he did technically miss a kick, but that was because it was blocked. Otherwise, made 2 of his field goals in which he didn't have pressure at the line of scrimmage. But the primary reason why I'm so confident in Chad Ryland is because of his efforts in 2024. In the final 13 games of the Cardinals season, averaged 9.23 fantasy points per game, and in winning efforts last season, averaged 10.14 fantasy points per game. They take on Carolina in week 2. They have a pretty good chance of winning that game. The final player is Brandon McManus, taking on Washington on a short week Thursday Night Football. In week 1, had 9 fantasy points, made 2 of his field goals, and even though it was a lower scoring game, we are anticipating hopefully a shootout come week 2 against this Washington Commanders defense. Last season, 2024 weeks 12 through 18, averaging 10.3 fantasy points per game in the final 7 games of the season. This should be an exciting matchup on Thursday. The streaming defenses I wanted to mention begin with the San Francisco 49ers. If they weren't already rostered and utilized in week 1, which they should have been, they scored 11 fantasy points. And this week they take on the New Orleans Saints. Even though the Cardinals, as a streaming option, disappointed in that fact, I do anticipate the 49ers defense to deliver. Then we move on to the New England Patriots, who will be taking on the Miami Dolphins defense. Of course, the Patriots only had 7 fantasy points against the Raiders in week 1, but that's a solid number in the grand scheme of week 1. When you're taking on the Miami Dolphins in week 2, a team that looked like an absolute train wreck, and a team that allowed the Colts defense to score 14 fantasy points, of course, this makes the New England Patriots a viable option. The final defense I wanted to mention are the Los Angeles Rams, currently rostered in 28% of sleeper leagues. As of right now, again, they scored 12 points in week 1 against Houston. They're taking on another AFC South team in the form of the Tennessee Titans, a team that just allowed the Denver Broncos defense to score 16 points in week 1. But when we travel back to 2024, in the final 3 regular season games of the Rams season, not including week 18, so weeks 15, 16, and 17. They scored 12, 9, and 14 fantasy points. The Rams should not only be picked up for this week, but for the remainder of the season. I had all 3 of these defenses ranked within my top 12 on Sunday morning. So hopefully you went ahead and picked them up and can utilize them for weeks ahead. Now, another defense that theoretically honorable mention, the Dallas Cowboys taking on that New York Giants offense that looked horrible, didn't score a single touchdown within that game. And there are still questions as to whether or not Russell Wilson with another dud performance like that could even make it past halftime with Jackson Dart waiting in the wings to potentially take over this organization. All right, let's go ahead and let's end out today's video by putting together a couple plays via Betr. Like I mentioned earlier, going into tonight's game, the Monday night matchup between the Bears and the Minnesota Vikings, I wanted to go ahead and share a couple of my plays. Let's check that out right now. So going into tonight's game, I like 2 players in specific, both at the tight end position. One being TJ Hawkinson, in which I'm going more than 2.5 receptions. The reason why I'm doing this is because the Bears struggled mightily against the tight end position last season in the 2 games in which, of course, TJ Hawkinson took on this defense. 14.9 and 7.7 fantasy points. 7 catches for 114, 5 catches for 52. I think the idea of him being able to surpass 2.5 receptions, very much so within the realm of possibility. And then we move on to the rookie tight end Colston Loveland. I really do like taking more on his 1.5 receptions. Again, you don't utilize first-round draft capital to have your tight end block. We saw Tyler Warren, who is also a first-round selected tight end in the 2025 NFL Draft, go off in week 1. Therefore, now it is Loveland's turn. Last season, in the last 4 games in which tight ends took on the Minnesota Vikings, we saw the Rams tight ends, 9 catches, 97 and a touchdown. Detroit tight ends, 7 for 63. Green Bay 3 for 57, and Seattle 6 for 80 and a touchdown. I would anticipate Colston Loveland to surpass the 1.5 receptions as the first-round selected Chicago Bear of the 2025 NFL Draft. All right, guys. Again, if you sign up today using code Andrew, and of course, make that first-time deposit minimum of $10, make that first-time play minimum of $1 within a real cash play, you'll of course be able to take advantage of the Sunday morning rankings. You'll also be able to get, JJ McCarthy at 0.5 passing yards. Add that to the potential play, and of course, check out Betr today. Thank you very much for everybody for watching today's waiver wire video. I'll be back tomorrow, of course, with a running back rankings, and of course, back later tonight after the Monday Night Football game to talk all things fantasy football via the live stream. Thank you everybody for watching, and until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.